right, so for number 1, we want to find the slope, distance, and midpoint. Let's do A. So our slope formula is what? y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. The change in y's over the change in x's. Our distance formula is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And then the midpoint formula, x1 plus x2 over 2 and y1 plus y2 over 2. These 3 formulas you have to know for your quiz tomorrow. So for A, let's start by finding the slope. So I would always just label your points first. So x1, y1, x2, y2. So this would be 6 minus 0, yes, over negative 3 minus 1. So 6 over negative 4 simplifies to what? Negative 3 over 2, perfect. We can divide the top and the bottom both by 2. So our slope is negative 3 over 2. Any questions there? Next, let's find the distance. So we have the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So x2 is negative 3 minus x1 is 1 squared plus y2 would be 6 minus y1 is 0 squared. So it's negative 3 minus 1. Negative 4 squared plus 6 minus 0 would be 6 squared. Negative 4 squared is 16, plus 6 squared would be 36, and 16 plus 36. $52. Always check to see if you can simplify your radical. Do we have 2 factors of 52? Four and what? 4 and 13. That works. If you didn't know that 4 goes into it, you can always start small. It's even, so we know 2 divides into it, so you could have said 2 and 26. It doesn't matter as long as you have factors that are correct. You'll end up with the same answer. 4 breaks down into what? 2 and 2. So whatever pair we have, that comes to the outside. So it'd be 2 square root. What stays on the inside? 13. So our distance would be 2 square root 13. Always, always, always make sure you can simplify. Simplify if you can. Any questions there? Last thing, let's find the midpoint. So our midpoint is the average of the x's and the average of your y's. Your midpoint is always going to be a point. It's the point in the middle of them. So here we have x1 plus x2 would be 1 plus negative 3 over 2. And y1 plus y2 would be 0 plus 6 over 2. So 1 plus negative 3 would be negative 2 over 2, and 0 plus 6 would be 6 over 2. So our point would be negative 1, comma 3. All right, let's take a look at number 2. We want to find the slope, y-intercept, and graph. So starting with A. How would we find the slope here? We want to solve for y. We can't clearly see what the slope is. It would help to put it in y equals mx plus b form to find what our m is. Whatever your m is, that's the slope. And whatever your b is, that is the y-intercept. So when we rearrange this into y equals mx plus b, we're going to isolate our y. We want to move everything else to the other side. So I'm going to add x to move it to the other side and subtract 9. So 3y is equal to x minus 9. Now we're almost there. We almost got the y all by itself. What would we have to do next? Divide by 3. So y is equal to x over 3, or we could say 1/3 x minus 3. So what's our slope here? 1/3. Awesome. Slope is the number in front of the x. What is our y-intercept? -3. So if we were to graph this, we'd start with the y-intercept. So that's where we cross the y-axis. So I'd put a point at -3. And how do we do the slope of 1/3? What is slope? What over what? Rise over run. So we'd go up 1 and to the right 3. You can keep putting points up 1 and to the right 3 if you want, but you really only need 2 to draw a straight line. 3, let's take a look at B. We want to determine if the lines are parallel, perpendicular, or neither. So here it gives us 2 lines, well, 2 points on each line. How can we tell if they're parallel, perpendicular, or neither? What are we looking at to determine if lines are parallel or perpendicular? The slope. What do we know about the slopes if the 2 lines are parallel? They're the same slope. What about perpendicular? Opposite reciprocals. So if our 2 lines have the same slope, they're parallel. If they have opposite reciprocal slopes, they're perpendicular. If the slopes are completely different, it would be neither. So in question A and B, you want to find the slopes. So this is kind of asking for the same thing, but the questions are just written a little bit differently. One gives us the lines as an equation. The other one gives us the lines as 2 points. So let's look at B. Let's find the slopes. How would we find the slope between 2 points? What would we need to do? We use our slope formula. Perfect. So y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. I'm going to label my points. x1, y1, x2, y2. Now these are 2 separate lines, so we just have to find each slope separately. We're just working with line 1 first. So -7 minus -16 over 0 minus 1. So -7 minus -16 turns into a plus. So -7 plus 16 would be 9 over -1. What does 9 over -1 simplify to? -9. Awesome. So we have our slope there. Let's do the same thing for our second line. We have x1, y1, x2, y2. So 11 minus -7 over x2 minus x1 would be -1 minus 1. So 11 minus -7 turns into a plus. So this would be 18 over -1 minus 1 would be -2. What's 18 over -2? -9. All right, so we found our 2 slopes. Would these lines be parallel, perpendicular, or neither? Parallel, because we have the same slope. So because these are the same, they are parallel. So So our answer here would be parallel. All right, next page. Write the equation of a line in slope-intercept form. We have two different questions here. One says through the points, and the other one says parallel to this line through the point. Let's look at B. So I'm going to write the equation of a line in slope-intercept form that's parallel to the line that's given, and it goes through for 2. So if it's parallel, what do we know about the slopes? They're the same slope. How do we find the slope of this line? What would we need to do? We want to isolate the y. We want to get it to be y equals mx plus b form. Slope-intercept form, so we can clearly identify what our slope is. So I'm going to subtract the 6x, move it to the other side. So 2y is equal to negative 6x plus 4. Divide everything by 2. So y is equal to negative 3x plus 2. So what's our slope here? Negative 3. And if we're talking about a line that's parallel to this one, what would the slope of a parallel line be? The same thing, negative 3. So now that we have a slope and we have a point that's given, we ignore the rest of this. We're only looking at the slope that's given here. The rest of the line does not matter. We're just looking at the slope. So we know that we have the same slope and it goes through this point. What would I need to do next? What do I have? The slope and a point. So we want to use point slope form. What is point slope form? Awesome. So these are another 2 formulas that you have to know for your quiz tomorrow. Point slope form and slope intercept form. So let's plug in our point and our slope. So y minus 2 is equal to negative 3 times x minus 4. The point that was given is our x1 and y1. So we plug that in and we plug in our slope. Can I leave my answer like this? No, why not? What's the question asking for? Slope-intercept form. This isn't slope-intercept form, this is point-slope form. So we got to rearrange this to be in slope-intercept form. So what would I need to do next? Distribute the negative 3. So y minus 2 is equal to negative 3x plus 12. We want to isolate our y, so we're going to add 2 to move it to the other side. Combine it with its like term, so y is equal to negative 3x plus 14. So this would be our answer. Right, on the next page, the next question, let's do A. We want to find the domain, range, and intervals of increasing, decreasing, and constant. So our domain talks about the x values. The range talks about the y values of our graph. And then intervals of increasing, decreasing, and constant always have to be 2 things. We'll always look at the x's. And it is always parentheses. So let's start with A. And let's do our domain. For the domain, we're talking about the x values, so we want to start at the left side and go to the right. What is the smallest x value that our graph has here? Awesome. We've got an arrow pointing to the left, and the left goes to negative infinity. So our graph would go parentheses, negative infinity. Remember, infinities always get parentheses. Now our graph keeps going, keeps going. At what x value do we stop at? 1, perfect. We see that we have a hole here at 1. We have a gap in our graph. So there is no value at 1 because those are both open circles. I don't have an x value at 1, bless you. So So we go 2, 1. Do I put a bracket or parentheses? Parentheses, because it's a whole. Now our graph keeps going. We still have more graph to the right of that. So I'm going to put a U for both parts of my graph that just says this part and this part. So if you have more than one interval, you need a U. Where does our graph stop? 4. Awesome. So we pick up again at 1 and we go to 4. Does 4 get a bracket or parentheses? Bracket. All right, so for our range, what is the smallest y value that our graph has here? Awesome, -1. Our smallest y value would be down here. Does that point get a bracket or parentheses? A bracket, -1, because it's not a whole. The line's continuous there. If we look at our graph, our line touches -1, so we got to include it. So it'd be bracket, -1. Where does our graph go to? What's our largest y value? What do we think? Infinity. Awesome. We do, even though we have a gap here, our y value, we still have y values over here. So our graph goes up to infinity. So if I were to hold my pencil horizontally and I start at the bottom, I'll see if I can do it with the highlight here. Our graph starts at -1. Our graph keeps going. We still touch graph whenever I'm holding my pencil horizontally here. I still touch graph, and then it keeps going up to infinity. So from -1 to infinity, I have graph that I'd be touching. Any questions there? All right, let's find our intervals now. So let's start with, we'll just start at the left side of our graph and work our way to the right. And we'll see what happens. So just like how we read going from left to right, we read a graph going from left to right. If I were to start at the left side of my graph, would I be walking uphill or downhill as I go to the right? Downhill. I'd be going downhill until what value? What x value? Zero. Awesome. So here is where we stop decreasing. So we are decreasing from where to where? -infinity to 0. Awesome. And increasing, decreasing, and constant always gets parentheses. Now at 0, do we start walking uphill or downhill? Uphill until where? Until 1. So we'd be increasing from 0 to 1. And then after 1, we have to jump a little bit, but we go up here. And then what happens? If we go to the right, are we going uphill or downhill? Uphill, so we'd be increasing. We're increasing until what value? 4, till the x value 4. We go increasing to here. So we'd put a union, because we're still increasing from 1 to 4. So we got to include that gap at the 1 because our graph doesn't exist at the x value of 1. So we are increasing from 0 to 1, put a union, and from 1 to 4. So for D, let's find our domain. What would the domain of our graph be? What's our smallest x value and our largest x value? So if we held our pencil in a vertical line at the left, what's the first x value that our graph touches? 0. The first x value that our graph touches would be 0. And it's a closed circle, so bracket 0. What's the last x value that our graph touches? 7. And it's an open circle at 7, so it'd be a parentheses. So our graph is in between the x values 0 and 7. Let's do the same thing with our y values. What's the smallest y value that our graph has? it'd be -1. And it's not an open or closed circle there, it's just a continuous line, so we'd have a bracket, -1. And what's the largest y value that our graph has? It goes up to 3 with a bracket. Now for increasing, decreasing, and constant, we can start at the left. Would we start walking uphill or downhill? Downhill. So we are decreasing from where to where? Awesome. Increasing, decreasing, and constant is just the x values. We can cross off the y values. We start at 0 and we go to 2 is where we stop increasing here. And increasing, decreasing, and constant is always parentheses. So from 0 to 2. Then at 2, we start walking uphill again. So we'd be increasing to what? To 6. Awesome. So from 2 to 6, we're increasing. And then once we get to 6, what happens again? We're decreasing. We're walking downhill. So from 6 to what? From 6 to 7. Awesome. And since we have 2 pieces of decreasing, we put a U in between them. Guys, one other thing I want to mention, which we talked about this in the notes, but just as a review. If our line is horizontal, what would the slope be here? 0. So our slope would be 0. And what would the equation of a line be here? X equals or y equals? Y equals. It intersects the y-axis. So since it touches the y-axis, it's y equals. So let's do the other one. If we have a vertical line, what's our slope here? Undefined. So M would be undefined. And then what type of line would we have? X equals, because it intersects the x-axis. So for our piecewise functions, we're going to start with B with our first piece. So what numbers do we start plugging in? The ones that are given. So here, -5 is given and -2 is given. So we're going to start by plugging in those. So you always start with the numbers that are given. So x is in between -5 and -2. So if I plug in, which technically we don't have anything to plug in here, but if I plugged in -5, what is my x, or what is my y going to be? 0. And at this point, do we have an open or closed circle? Closed, because it's less than or equal to, so we put a closed circle here. So I'm going to go to the left to -5 and stay at 0 and put a closed circle. Now we're going to do the same thing with -2. So if I plugged in -2, which here I don't really have anything to plug it into, what's my y going to be? 0. The y is always just 0 here when it's constant. We're not plugging it in. It's telling us y is always 0. At -2, 0, do I have an open or closed circle? An open circle, because it is just a less than sign. So we put an open circle. So I'm going to go to the left to -2, stay at 0, and put an open circle. Then from here, we can connect our 2 points. All right, let's do our second piece of the graph. What number are we going to start plugging in here? -2. We always start with the numbers that are given. So -2. We have -2 squared plus 4. That negative is on the outside. Make sure you follow your order of operations here. So we have to square it first. So -2 squared would be 4. That negative on the outside makes it -4. And -4 plus 4 is 0. So So our point would be negative 2 comma 0. Does this get an open or closed circle here? Closed circle. Since it is a less than or equal to, we put a closed circle. So at negative 2, 0, I put a closed circle. They overlap, but that's fine. What other number do I want to plug in here? 1. We always want to plug in the numbers that are given. So let's plug in 1. So negative 1 squared plus 4. 1 squared would be 1. The negative on the outside makes it negative 1. Negative 1 plus 4 would be 3. So my point here, I plugged in 1 and got 3. Is this an open or closed circle? Closed circle, because it is a less than or equal to. It makes it a closed circle. So we go to the right 1 and up 3. Am I going to connect these 2 points with a line? Is this piece of my graph linear? No, it's not. What shape does this piece of my graph have? If it's x squared, what type of graph do we have? A parabola. If it's x squared, it's going to be a parabola, which means that it's U-shaped, so it's either an up or a down U. So in order to figure out what shape my graph has in between these 2 points, what should we do? Just guess? Just draw it? How do we know where it's going to be in between these 2 points? What should we do? So for parabolas, you always want to plug in 3 points. Parabolas are a little bit different than just a linear graph. For a line, you only need 2 points to draw a straight line through it. Parabola is not a straight line. It's got curve. So we got to know what type of curve we have. So let's pick a number in between negative 2 and 1. What number do you want to plug in? You can pick anything. 0. Great choice. Let's plug in 0. So 0 squared plus 4, negative 0 squared plus 4 would be 0 plus 4, which is 4. So we plugged in 0 and got 4. Now this isn't one of our key values that were given, so it doesn't get an open or closed circle. It's just a point on the line. So we're going to stay at 0, go up 4. Now do you think we have enough information to draw a graph? If you want, you could plug in negative 1. You could plug in, that's probably your only other point in between these two because you wouldn't want to plug in a fraction. But this gives us enough direction. We're going to now connect our points with a curve. We know that our parabola is U-shaped. This parabola was negative x squared, so the parabola opens down. So if you connected these 2 points with a straight line, it would be wrong. I got to see that curve. Parabolas, you need to have 3 points so I can see the curve. Any questions with the second piece of our graph? All right, let's do the third piece now. What number do we want to plug in first? 2. We always plug in the number that's given. So we have negative 2 plus 3, which gives us 1. We plugged in 2 and got 1. Does this have an open or closed circle? Open circle, because it's just a less than sign. So we're going to go to the right 2 and up 1, put an open circle. Now we just have a point here. What type of graph do we have here? It's negative x plus 3. What's the shape of this graph going to be? It's going to be linear. It'll be a line. So we need 2 points. What's another point that I could plug in? Yes. 3. Awesome. This says 2 is less than x, which is the same thing as saying x is greater than 2. So we want to plug in a number that satisfies this. You have to plug in a number into x that is greater than 2. So 3 works. 3 is awesome. Negative 3 plus 3 would be 0. So we plugged in 3 and got 0. Now this point isn't one of the key points that we have to start with, so it's not an open or closed circle. This point just gives us direction. It's just a point on the line. So we're going to go to the right 3 and stay at 0. Once we have 2 points, we can connect the points with a line. Now here our graph has an arrow because it keeps going forever. We could have plugged in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 100 if we wanted to. There's no upper restriction on this. It doesn't give us 2 numbers to plug in where we have to have an open or closed circle, so we just put an arrow through our points. We always start with the point that's given. That's why we started with the open circle. And the second point just gives us direction, so we go through that point. So notice here how the middle piece had -2 to 1. The third piece was x is greater than 2. So we kind of have a gap from 1 to 2. There is no graph x value that exists from 1 to 2. So that's why it disconnects. It's not always going to connect at the end of the next one. So sometimes there can be a gap. Sometimes your graph may go like up here. The next piece may start over here. It totally just depends on what's given. They're not always going to connect. Any questions here?